Welcome, J.W. Mason. You are an associate professor of economics at John Jay College, City University of New York. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start by asking about the general situation in the US. I want to talk about the mayor election and Zohran Mamdani, but let's start out with the general view and what's going on with the US. We're hearing some pretty alarming news about what's going on with Trump and the way he's sending federal agents into cities and fomenting riots and kidnapping people off the street. And he wants to start wars with Venezuela, and he's been waging wars in the Middle East. And even if that's on pause now, when Trump first came into office, I thought that the talk about fascism was perhaps an exaggeration. But how would you define the situation now with Trump? Is there a genuine threat of fascism, or should we call it something else?
Well, it's hard to think what the right model is, historically, because along with the things that you mentioned, one of the most striking features of Trumpism is the attack on the federal government itself. With the Doge in the beginning, Elon Musk at the beginning of the administration, shutting down whole agencies, firing people left and right, both line workers and, appointed leaders of various supposedly independent agencies. And now the shutdown, which is, the federal government is shut down for some indefinite period, and they're using that as an excuse to fire more people, and just a total withdrawal of the federal government from a lot of the roles that it used to play. So that I don't know if fascism, although there certainly are parallels, and I think we should remember that classic fascism took a lot of its inspiration from the regime existing already in the U.S. South. Certainly
Hmm.
for people, like in Germany in the 30s, the U.S. South and its racial regime was a model that they consciously looked to. So fascism is not an foreign import to the United States. It has deep roots in our history in the South, especially, but not only in the South, of kind of violently enforced racial hierarchy. Um, but Trump, although certainly we have strong elements of that, there also is this other element, which is this attack on the federal government itself, an attack on science, on expertise, on public health, that is not something that one necessarily associates with the idea of fascism, that is often imagined to involve a strong, expanded role for the state. So I don't know. Sometimes I think that, you can think about the end of the Soviet Union and sort of this elite kind of dismantling their own government structures. It's interesting or obviously a lot of the history of neoliberalism with governments being compelled under the pressures of finance or under the pressures of institutions like the IMF to scale back their activities and withdraw from areas that they previously had been present in. But of course, the US is not doing this under any sort of external pressure from finance or foreign institutions. So that's not an exact match either. So it's a little bit of a, I think honestly, I think it's a little bit of a I don't know. It's hard to find exact historical precedents for what we're experiencing right now.
Hmm. But if we think about more specifically what he's doing with the immigration agency, ICE, and how he's targeting people and arresting not only immigrants, but people that are citizens and sometimes taking their property and sending them into to prisons in El Salvador and things like that. That has kind of a fascist flavor from what it seems like.
Oh, for sure. No, I mean this is a wholesale attack on people just based on their ancestry and just based on their appearance, and they're explicitly acknowledging that. But I do also again have to say this is not without precedent in U.S. history. Our immigration regime was extremely violent and oppressive before Trump came in. Tom Homan, who is running this whole machinery in the Trump administration, occupied a similar role in the Obama administration. He's
Hmm.
somebody who was elevated to be in charge of deportations by Obama and given an award for the number of deportations that he carried out, which was very high. In some ways, what's different under Trump is that a regime that was largely limited to the areas near the border has been extended to other parts of the country. But the idea of, let's say stopping a car based on the appearance of the people in it, taking those people and perhaps not giving them much of an opportunity to demonstrate their citizenship and deporting them, holding them in inhumane conditions. This is something that existed in the United States before Trump came into office. And ICE, in some ways, I think ICE and the Border Patrol, as much as anything else, Trump has simply taken whatever restraints were on them off and allowed them to do what the people already present in those institutions wanted to do in any case. And, a lot of people today, I think, want to draw a line between ICE and the National Guard and local police forces on the other side. But as we know, policing in the United States is extremely violent and often quite lawless. I think there are many parts of the U.S. where police have operated as something between, right-wing paramilitaries and violent gangs without much oversight at all from the elected officials they supposedly answer to. So I think again we should see Trump as an intensification, certainly as an intensification and extension of um, uh, phenomena that were already very much present in American politics.
Mm. And what can you say about the resistance to this intensification?
Well, it's a little bit. I mean, I think there is, certainly in Chicago, we've seen in LA, we've seen a lot of popular protest in Portland, and that's very heartening. I think, there's not and never has been majority support. I think in the US, I think there's always been a very inconsistent and sort of conflicted view of immigration because, immigration is obviously a central part of our history as a country in a way that isn't true in most other parts of the world. And most people can, trace their ancestry to somebody who immigrated here. And most people have positive personal relationships with immigrants. And, we have, so at the same time, we've had for a long time an extremely rigid law about immigration, making it almost impossible for people from much of the world to legally enter the United States. And so you end up with millions of people in this gray area where, they live here, they work here, they're accepted members of the community on a day-to-day level, but legally they have no rights in the United States. Legally, they could be subject. And again, it's true under Biden, under Obama, in most of the country, this was not really aggressively enforced. But legally, in a sense, the law always said these people don't belong here. They should be removed. They have no rights. They are not entitled to any due process. They're sort of almost non-persons from the point of view of the law. So we've kind of just sort of allowed this kind of contradictory situation to continue. And I think perhaps, if you're optimistic, you could say one of the outcomes of the Trump episode, assuming it comes to an end, is to force people to confront the fact that our legal regime around immigration is really not consistent with the way most people think about it, and we need a system that is, allows people to enter the country and allows people who are in the country for however they got here to have a legal status and to have the right to remain here. I think we're beginning to see that. I think we are seeing some shifts in opinion, both, which you see in opinion polls and elite opinion on the Democratic side, that you need to oppose Trump's views on immigrations with a clear alternative view that says if somebody is living and working here, they're an American, however they arrived here. But I think we've got a ways to go. The other thing I would say, I think the key site for resistance to a lot of this is local officials, and there's a wide range. I think there's a lot of officials who just have sort of adopted the attitude, well, if the federal government says to do something, we have to do it. And of course, there are plenty of local officials who agree with the substance of what Trump is doing. But there's a lot of space in the American federal system for officials who don't, agree to resist in various ways, to not comply. And I think this sort of non-compliance is actually a really powerful weapon to just say, we're not following this instruction. We don't recognize its legality. A little story, but I think a telling one. Kirsty Noem, the Interior Secretary, had wanted to put up a message saying that the any service interruptions at the airport are because the Democrats are causing a shutdown, and have that be kind of shown as a public service message in airports. And a lot of airport administrators say, no, we can't show that. That's a political message. So there's a lot of sort of sites of autonomy within the governmental system that have not been political. You're administering an airport. You're not supposed to be a political actor, but suddenly you're faced with these choices where you actually have to behave politically. And I think after being sort of stunned into submission in the early part of the Trump era, more people in those sort of roles of authority are recognizing that they actually have choices to make.
Mm. And about immigration, it seemed for a while that maybe the contradiction that you mentioned between the legal regime and the actual reality of people living here, illegal, living there in society without actually being allowed to do so. It seemed for a while that it was going to be resolved in the other way with an amnesty, and you've had amnesties earlier, right, where
That's
people have
right. In the
been.
1980s was the last major one. But there was a lot of support under the first Bush administration. It's really striking how, under the first Bush administration, there was a lot of congressional support, by prominent Republicans as well as Democrats for an amnesty because people recognize this is not a sustainable situation to have people who are here but have no legal status. We can't, that's not, that just doesn't make sense. You can't have this sort of glaring contradiction between what the law says and how people are actually living their lives. And so the natural thing is to change the law. And there was, we came very close in the first, the George W. Bush came very close to passing some kind of amnesty. Um, and public opinion, I mean, it's sort of a puzzle, but there was a period where it really there was a lot of support for a more liberal immigration regime. And then, in the, 2010s, and you know, I'd have to go back and look at the dates, but at some point during the decade of the 2010s, there was a real swing the other way. And I think, in some ways, Trump both rode that swing, but also I think really contributed and amplified it. Really, the Republicans under Trump sort of took this anti-immigrant politics that had not been as prominent and really elevated it and shifted public opinion. But I think now there's a kind of swing back the other way again.
Okay. Because in Europe it's all swung the same way as the US, although not as extreme. But there's consensus now from the center left to the far right that immigration is a problem and we should close the borders and so on.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah,
I was just going to say, it's a funny thing that until recently, I would have said the U.S. this is, there's a lot of things as an American on the left that one admires about European social democracy. But I would have said until recently that on immigration, that was an area where the U.S. actually had more advanced and progressive, you know, um, positions and policies than Europe. But unfortunately, at the moment, that is not the case.
yeah, we used to have a pretty contradictory stance here in Europe, where we were very open toward immigration, but not toward actually providing jobs and houses
Mm.
and infrastructure to sort of welcome them in or integrate them in society, and that has led to a backlash toward closed borders. But something that's happened lately in the U.S., which seems sort of like a part of the resistance to Trump, or sort of a progressive response to Trump, is of course Zohran Mamdani's campaign in New York, and it seems as though he will probably get elected mayor, right, on November 4th.
Yeah, I think at this point, one doesn't want to take anything for granted, but I think something really extraordinary would have to happen to prevent him from being elected at this point.
And how unexpected is this if we go back, say, 6 months, that he was the favorite to win? How unexpected is that?
No one, perhaps I'm not sure, but let's say if we go back last fall when the first conversations about him running were happening, Um, I think it was considered an extreme long shot. I think many people within Democratic Socialists of America, the organization he comes out of, were opposed to the race because of the view that it was just not it was impossible to win. It would be a distraction and a waste of resources and energy to do this completely quixotic campaign. Um, I think even in March. I think certainly the polls started shifting in April. April is also when I personally started volunteering to knock on doors for the Mamdani campaign, which really shifted my perspective when I saw the level of enthusiasm, the number of other people volunteering, especially new volunteers, people who had never been engaged in politics, a lot of South Asians, partly because of where I live in New York, but of course also because of that's a group that really has identified with Mamdani. But a lot of people who have not been part of left-wing politics in New York coming out to support the campaign. So I think, and certainly the polls, but nobody expected his victory to be on the scale that it was. Certainly, I don't think the polls ever suggested as large a victory in the primary, and I don't think anybody in the campaign or anybody in the press, people thought maybe he can pull this off, but instead he won decisively. And I think it was really a shock to almost everybody who was involved
Mm.
in New York politics.
Yeah. So just to explain to the viewers, Zohran Mamdani, he's a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, but he ran on the Democratic ticket and he won the Democratic primary in June. So how does that work? How can a member of a socialist party run as a Democrat, or is it not a party?
Well, this is maybe getting a little off on a tangent, but American political parties are not what people imagine in most of the world a political party to be, and not even what most Americans who aren't familiar with them sort of imagine them to be. American political parties are really almost branches of the government as opposed to parties in the sense of private political organizations. A political party in New York and in most of the United States has no say in who its candidates will be, which seems again to be not a political party. The law sets down very strict rules about a primary election process that every party must hold. People who are registered to vote in the party get a vote in the primary, and the party has no say in who registers to vote. So there's no concept, for instance, in the US of dues paying party members. That's not something that exists in the United States. There's no possibility of parties that are affiliated with other organizations the way labor parties in some parts of the world are affiliated with unions. That's not legally possible in the United States. So in many ways, the party primary is simply a first round of elections. If you think of a two-round election system, like France or other places have, we have that, and we call the first round the party primaries. But in practice, the parties as institutions have no control over the primary process, and anybody who wants to can run in that primary. And in New York, it's even possible to run in the primary of multiple parties, although that's not Zohran Mamdani is running only as a Democrat.
Mm. And what would you say is the secret to his success?
I think, partly, honestly, it's that he is an incredibly charismatic, energetic, appealing person. And I think a lot of us on the left don't like to think about politics that way. We like to think that it's about organizations and it's about everybody coming together. And of course, we absolutely need that, or it's about deep structural forces, and often it's that too. But there is, I think, especially in the United States, which, as I said a moment ago, lacks political parties in the traditional sense. I think that really means that there's even a greater importance to the individual personalities. In many ways, that's how American politics works. It's all based around individuals, and uh, and so having the right individual makes a big difference. But of course, it's not only that. I think there's a real moment. I think that in the Trump moment and in a moment when a lot of the older established figures in the Democratic Party have really failed to rise to the moment, have failed to vocally oppose Trump, have failed to offer any sort of um, clear alternative vision. I think Mamdani, people really were drawn to the idea that here's somebody who's cheerful and upbeat, but has a real strong alternative vision of what the country should be like. And then another thing I would say is he campaigned, his sort of central message was about affordability. Now, he did not, and I think this is important, he did not shy away from other types of issues. He was very forthright and vocal in his support for the people of Gaza and his opposition to the genocidal war being waged by Israel there. And I think, in the past, people have thought of that as being something you just could not do in American politics. So I think it's very important. He didn't run away from that. He didn't, run away from the issues of rights for transgender people. But his central focus, the thing he always brought his campaign back to, and his message was organized around, was around affordability, affordability of housing, affordability of food, affordability of transportation, affordability of childcare. Um, and I think what's interesting about that is it shows, the issue of inflation, which has been so central to politics in the last few years and tends to get seen as a right-wing issue, something that empowers, conservative politicians that gets framed as a matter of government spending too much money or wages rising too quickly. That same issue of inflation and the cost of living can be reframed in a way that really advances a very different politics. When you say, the fundamental problem here is why don't we build enough housing? We need government to take more action to build housing. Why do we have grocery stores that are where in the food system are people making big profits, and what can we do about that to get those costs down? We need government to provide childcare because it's just so prohibitively expensive. So you can take that same basic issue of the cost of living and use it as a way of um, motivating a left-wing program. I think that
Mm.
was a really important lesson of his campaign.
Yeah, because if you define inflation as a problem of just too much spending or people have too high wages, and if you define the solution, as is commonly done now, as austerity, the only way to beat inflation is to just raise interest rates or cut down government spending or raise taxes, then of course you can't have that message as a leftist. But I think this point is really important that there are alternative ways to both explain inflation, why it happens, and also then how to beat inflation, how to lower costs directly.
Yeah, I think it's interesting in a way that there's been a conversation about alternative views of inflation happening, over the last few years, and you've been somewhat part of that, and other folks, and people like Isabella Weber in particular, really elevating a view that instead of seeing it as purely a macro phenomenon where it's too much spending in the aggregate or too much demand, seeing it in terms of particular prices. Inflation is fundamentally about rising prices, and prices, when we're thinking about rising prices in the aggregate, we should think about the same things that we think about when we think about prices at the micro level. So, our price is rising because there's a supply constraint, because there's some obstacle to increasing production of something in line with demand for it. Well, then we should figure out what is that supply constraint. And maybe that's a big piece of the housing story. In other cases, it's an exercise of market power, and we need to identify where that market power is and restrain it either through antitrust measures or regulation or in some other way. And in some cases, it may be that there's just something that the private sector is not well suited to produce. And then if you want to keep costs down, you need to have a bigger direct public role. But when you shift the conversation from prices in the abstract to particular price of particular things, the solutions to the problem, tend to look very different. And, obviously Mamdani is not citing that kind of work explicitly on the campaign trail, but I
Mhm.
think there's a certain way in which his message grew out of that conversation.
Yeah, I think that's really key that you have to look at the which prices are rising and why. For instance, food prices and energy prices, if they are high, maybe we should put a cap on energy, or maybe we should lower energy taxes or lower taxes on food, or sort of uh, that's a proposal that we have had here in Sweden at our think tank when sort of
Hmm.
inflation was really high and food prices was a major component. We suggested that why don't you just remove the VAT on food for a while to bring down costs directly? And one of the things that really are driving inflation in New York, I would assume, is rents. And that's something that Mamdani has been really vocal about, that you need to freeze rents. And here is an issue where a lot of inflation hawks that say they're very hawkish on inflation, but if you mention rent control, then they would say, "Oh no, we can't do that." So I know that you have been a one of the few economists that have been very supportive of rent control. So could you talk a little bit about how rents figure in Mamdani's campaign and what your view on rents and rent control is?
Yeah, rents are definitely the biggest piece in New York City, certainly of the affordability problem, and arguably a central piece nationally in the U.S. at least. Um, and it's a tricky issue because there are a lot of different pieces, but certainly the first thing to understand is that houses are, and buildings and general structures are very long lived, and a lot of the cost is the construction cost. So the actual price of rental housing is not reflective of the cost of producing that service in the current moment. So people say, well, if you cap the price of milk, people just aren't going to make as much milk and sell as much milk. That may or may not be true of milk, but milk is very different from housing because the cost of producing milk is basically incurred at the moment that you produce the milk. There aren't big capital costs that were incurred years or decades ago, and housing is at the opposite extreme there. So that means that the price that's being charged today is not necessarily reflective of the cost of providing the service today. There's a big gap there. And then again, on the other side, the fact that the supply of housing responds very slowly, if it responds at all, means there's a lot of space for the market price of housing as a service to deviate from whatever the underlying cost of providing it is. And that's a space that it's very natural to have regulation. This is something that at one point was sort of common sense, that if you have when you have services where you have very big capital costs and where you have a degree of market power because supply is not going to adjust very rapidly, those are prices that have to be regulated. The market price is not going to be in any sense a rational or efficient price. So that's the beginning of wisdom here. But there's other things that are more specific to housing that the fact that a lot of the value of housing doesn't come from the sort of physical house. I mean, some of it does. Bigger house rents for more than a smaller house, of course. But a lot of the value of a home comes from where it's located. And that, has nothing to do with anything being done by the individual landlord. It's just if the value of housing in an area goes up because that area becomes more attractive for whatever reason, the higher rents that result from that are just a windfall for the incumbent landlord, or the higher property values are a windfall for the incumbent property owners. And there's no social value in allowing them to capture that windfall. That is not a reward for anything they've done productively.
Mm.
And so there's absolutely no social cost to regulating that and saying that the current tenants or prospective home buyers in that area should also be able to share in whatever positive developments have made housing there more desirable. So there's a big space for rent freeze, but we should also be very clear. The Mamdani proposal on housing is not just a rent freeze. A rent freeze is just one piece of the puzzle. And for one thing, there is a genuine problem in the sense that although the cost of providing housing in many cases is much less than the market rent, that's almost always the case. And the cost of providing housing in terms of the cost of operating and maintaining an apartment building in New York has not risen particularly rapidly in recent years, certainly not as rapidly as rents have risen, market rents. But the cost to an individual property owner is not just the cost of operating and maintaining the building, but also their debt service, because this is a business that makes very heavy use of leverage. And so somebody who buys an apartment building to operate it is typically taking on considerable debt to do so, and they're doing that on the expectation of getting a certain rent out of that building. And if the rental income is less than they anticipated, for whatever reason. And in the specific New York case, our rent regulations were strengthened considerably in 2019. New York has had rent regulations since the early 20th century, but at some periods it's stronger and in some periods it's weaker. And in after a number of reforms in the early 21st century, it was relatively easy for landlords, for instance, to evict tenants, raise the rent significantly for the new tenants. There was a bonus whenever the apartment turned over, you could raise the rent. Um, so people bought buildings in the expectation that they would be able to raise the rents. If this is a building in a newly desirable area with lower income tenants, you kick them out, you bring in new tenants, you get a higher rent. So you'll pay a lot of money for that building, which means you'll take on a lot of debt to buy that building. In 2019, we had a reform to our rent laws, which I think was a very positive reform, that essentially made it impossible it closed almost all the loopholes. So basically, if there's a regulated rent for an apartment, that is the regulated rent, and there's almost nothing the landlord can do to change that. If you kick out your current tenant, and rent to somebody new, the regulated rent doesn't change. So again, I think a very positive thing, but the effect of it from the landlord's point of view is a lot of people had taken on a lot of debt to buy buildings in the anticipation of rising rents that now weren't materializing. And so the individual landlord is in genuine financial distress. It is
Mm.
genuine, even though the cost of maintaining and operating a building has not risen relative to rents. But a lot of landlords are struggling to make their debt service payments. And so anything you do that limits rent growth, whether it's freezing the rent through the Rent Guidelines Board, which is the body that sets regulated rents in New York. And I should say about half of the rental housing in New York is regulated. Newer buildings are not regulated unless the landlord voluntarily enters that system as a condition of getting some kind of public subsidies. But if you just build a new apartment building in New York and you don't take public money, that those rents are not regulated. You can set them wherever you want. But older buildings in New York, those built before roughly 1970, and then again, ones where the landlord voluntarily entered the rent regulation system as a condition of getting some public subsidy, that's about half of the housing stock, and that's those rents. The maximum allowable increase is set by the Rent Guidelines Board each year.
And that makes
So
sense because if you're worried about rent control stopping new construction, if you only have it on old buildings, then that solves that problem, right?
that's right. It's very rational, and also, the Rent Guidelines Board sets a rate of increase of rents. The absolute rent, is not set by them, so it doesn't look like a price control as people imagine it.
Mm.
Um, but in any case, whether it's the Rent Guidelines Board setting a lower allowable increase, or if rents don't rise for some other reason because we get a lot of new supply or because there's less demand for housing in the city, if whatever happens that means that the landlords do not get the rate of rent increase that they were counting on, then they have debt that they can't pay. And it's a genuine problem. Again, you could say it's not our problem, it's their bad bets, but the problem is that you have landlords in that situation, they're going to prioritize, paying their debt over doing maintenance, and you have a problem of livability. Even if the rents are affordable, if the building is not habitable, that's not a good situation. So you have to take some other steps, and I think there's going to be some real struggle to figure out whether that is a real increase in public ownership. You say, okay, if you can't pay your debt, and we'll buy the building at some reasonable price, or whether it's some kind of system where you convince the lenders to write down some of that debt. The other side of on this piece is you've got to really enforce building codes, and I think that's going to be very important, because again, you have these building owners who are in financial distress, and the thing they're going to cut corners on is maintenance, and so you've got to really, really enforce building codes aggressively, and I think that's something they're going to do. But then
Mm.
there's a whole other piece, and that's the supply side. And I think, there's online, there's a lot of, I think, very unproductive and unhelpful debates between NIMBYs, not in my backyard, and NIMBYs, yes, in my backyard. And people make this out as either you're going to, focus on the market power of the landlords and restrict rent increases, or you're going to focus on supply. But these are absolutely complementary approaches. And any situation in which one of them is a good idea, the other one is also a good idea. It's really the same underlying situation, I think, calls for both measures to limit the market power of existing landlords and to boost supply. And I think that's something that Mamdani really recognizes. I think it's really refreshing that he's got very much of a both and approach to housing, where you're going to freeze the rent and you're going to enforce building codes and prevent, predatory behavior by existing landlords, but you're also really going to focus on boosting supply, which means allowing a lot more private development. It means reforming zoning, and that's one. Our current mayor, Eric Adams, who's a kind of corrupt clown and has not been a good mayor in many ways, but one positive thing he did do is pass a major reform to New York City's zoning laws, making it easier to build high density near transit lines and in the closer in parts of the city, but we can go a lot farther in that direction and make the whole permitting process for new buildings smoother. I think there's still a lot of space to do, even though New York City is by far the densest major American city and has the most multifamily housing. Most people here live in apartment buildings, but there's still lots of the city that is zoned for single family housing or lower density housing that certainly could support higher density and opening up new development. And yes, for-profit developers, letting them build market rate housing is part of the solution. And then, the third, well, there's the other piece of the puzzle is where the city comes in. And I think there's a couple of ways. You need to provide, I think, in a lot of cases, public financing, because in the same way that owners of buildings expect a high return and borrow money in the expectation of a high return, private developers don't go forward with a project. The equity investors, who are providing 30, 40, 50% of the funding want a 20% return. And lenders, who are providing the rest of the financing, especially at the construction loan, are also charging very high interest rates. So low income housing or even middle income housing that is not expected to see significant rent growth is not going to be attractive to developers. So even if you reform the land
Mm.
use rules, you're also probably going to need significant public financing and public ownership to make a lot of projects go forward. And of course, that's just on the financing side. In principle, the city gets that money back. Then, of course, when you're talking about deeply affordable housing, you need ongoing subsidies to make that work.
Yeah, and
So
that's
I think
always the case. Yeah.
yeah. So it's really going to be an all of the above approach, I think. And what's again positive, I think, about Mamdani and his team is that they recognize that.
Mm. So he has a big plan for housing. He's also promised free childcare, I think, and free buses and government-run grocery stores to lower prices. So
That's right.
he has a
Yeah.
very ambitious agenda. What do you think the chances are that he will be able to implement this agenda, or what kind of resistance will he face?
Well, the funny thing is that a lot of these proposals are actually pretty mainstream in New York Democratic politics. Our governor, Kathy Hochul, who's, very much presented herself as a moderate, although she has endorsed Mamdani now, which a number of other prominent Democrats still have not done. Um, but as a sort of moderate, from Buffalo, from upstate, who in some ways she got on I'd forgotten this, but someone reminded me last night, one of her sort of rises to prominence as a Buffalo politician was opposing the then New York governor's proposal to give driver's licenses to undocumented immigrants. She was like standing in the courthouse door saying, "We will not have any, illegal aliens with driver's licenses here in Buffalo." So, in other words, she sort of began her career on the right side of New York politics, but she's very much somebody who's, I think, tries to go where the electoral wind is blowing, and right now it is blowing to the left in New York. And she's been very clear. She supports free childcare, and she wants to make free childcare happen. And she doesn't want to raise taxes on the rich, of which we have many here in New York. And so we may end up with a compromise where we get free childcare, but the taxes that pay for it are not very progressive. But in terms of the principle that childcare should be a universal public service that's free to everyone, is actually in some ways sort of a mainstream position in New York politics. It's the difference of somebody who's really willing to campaign on it and push for it aggressively, and especially make the case that we need the revenue to match it. But the principle is not controversial among New York Democrats. The free buses, I think that's come in for a lot of criticism. But we have a pilot program where one bus line in each of the five boroughs is free. This was a pilot program that was passed by a very large majority in the New York State Legislature a few years ago. It was one of Mamdani's signature issues as a state legislator, but he got very wide support for it. We've been running this pilot program, which has been pretty successful. The free buses do have quite a bit more ridership, and it doesn't seem to be coming from other parts of the transit system. It seems to be people using transit who would not otherwise be using transit. Um, so it's the principle again is something a lot of you. I mean, you don't vote for a pilot unless you're at least open to making this a general policy.
Hmm.
Um, I think the cost is significant but not prohibitive. I think so. I think doing it is executing it is challenging, but it's not like you're facing a wall of just diehard opposition to this stuff. And the grocery stores, that's a smaller thing. That's not a big price tag. It's less about, I think there are food deserts. There are parts of the city that lack decent options for groceries, and it seems very natural for the public sector to step in there. But I think a big part of it, honestly, is to have a better understanding of the business. I think there's a long tradition. If you're worried that you've got private actors that are ripping off the public in some way, one very good way for the government to get a handle on that is to operate a similar business
Hmm.
itself and get kind of
That's interesting.
firsthand direct information. During, for instance, World War II, this was a very big part of military contracting was the military really wanted to have their own plants that they operated in various areas as a check on the costs that they were being reported by various contractors. So this is not exactly parallel, but there is an issue. I think it's not obvious whether there's actually big. I think the conventional wisdom would be that grocery retail is a very low margin business, and if there's excess profits being made, they're higher up the chain at the distributor and wholesale level. But I think it's absolutely reasonable to say, let's get the city operating some grocery stores and actually get some more direct information about whether the costs that retailers are charging are actually reflective of the cost of operating the business or whether there's actually wider margins than we thought there.
That's an interesting point. I haven't heard that before. But it seems like you mentioned before that Mamdani has sort of an alternative vision that he's presenting to the public, and it seems like you could perhaps summarize that vision as something like economic rights, that people should have a right to healthcare, a right to childcare, a right to transit, a right to live in the city and afford to live in the city. And we often think about, or outside the United States, we often think about the United States as this sort of super capitalist mecca. But there has been a history of socialism and socialist mayors in New York even before, right? And other parts of the country. So it wouldn't be such a complete break with the past of the New Deal era, for example, or
Yeah, I mean, New York has an incredible tradition of public provision of all kinds of goods. We've still, especially not only by the government, but especially, by the historically extremely strong labor movement in New York, where you had, huge amounts of housing built uh, by unions and having some type of cooperative ownership structure. We have, banks and insurance companies that were founded by unions that still operate here that were intended to offer an alternative. I think there's a notion of economic rights that come in here, that these are, making political questions out of things that weren't considered political questions, I think is a big part of it. I was talking, I was at another event talking about the Mamdani campaign last night, and one of the other panelists said something that I thought was really smart, which is that, something like a lot of people, economists, think that rent control is fine, but you should have sort of an automatic formula that sets what the allowable rent is each year. Whereas in New York, we have the Rent Guidelines Board that has, it has representatives of tenants, it has representatives of property owners, and then it has, representatives of government. They're all appointed by the mayor, but they're supposed to represent
mm,
these different constituencies, and they make a decision about the allowable rent increases, sort of taking into account various factors. And so there's a certain kind of technocratic mindset that says that doesn't make sense. You should have a formula, look at the CPI. But the great thing about having a board is that it makes it a political question. It makes it a question about public debate. It makes it clear that this is a choice we are collectively making about what the rents are going to be. And I think that's actually really powerful. And I think that's sort of part of the Mamdani message is these things are choices. These things are things that we can collectively decide on, and we, acting through government, can take action in these areas and decide what the outcomes are going to be. And I think so. I think it's partly, yes, that you have a right to a city you can afford. That's sort of his message. You have a right to housing that you can afford and to childcare and to have your basic needs met. But also that the way we are going to see that these rights are upheld, it's not by having some right on paper that you can go sue somebody for. It's because we are going to collectively take responsibility for the provisioning of these basic goods. And we're going to have the government active in these areas in a way that has not recently been something that it's been expected to do.
mm. And there's one right that he might have some difficulties of providing, and that is the right to a job. Or do you think that he could have jobs programs in New York, or would that be sort of a budgetary question that he can't really?
That hasn't been part of the conversation recently. I mean, partly because, we had a quite strong economy before COVID. The city lost a lot of population during COVID, which is not fully returned yet. But in terms of the job market, it's been a pretty good time. In other words, unemployment, a lack of jobs is not an acute problem. I think the experience a lot of people have is it's not hard to find a job. The problem is that even what seems like a decent wage is not going to meet your living costs here. Now, he does support a much higher minimum wage in New York, raising the minimum wage to $30 an hour, which sounds like a very high number, but when you actually look at what's happened to wages over the last few years and what's happened to prices over the last few years, is not really necessarily a much larger rise than, for instance, the last minimum wage increase we had, which was to $15 an hour, back in about a decade ago, almost a decade ago. So, um, uh, so the minimum wage, the jobs program, again, it's just mass unemployment is not the problem in New York, and so I don't think that feels like the place where people are looking for solutions, particularly.
Mm. That's uh that's a big problem for us now in Sweden, has been for a while. So we should talk to you about full employment specifically in some way, because that's something that I feel strongly that Swedish and European politicians and people on the left even need to think about more. But we can save that for another day. So what do you think would happen to democratic politics or the Democratic Party if or when Zoran, I'll say if, not to jinx it, if he
Mhm.
wins, would that sort of have any reverberations in the Democratic Party? Would socialism become more of a strong force, or
I think
think?
so, absolutely. I think we're already seeing it. I think, the reality is a lot of most politicians, in my experience, are not particularly ideological. And if Zoran is able to win and win decisively on this platform, that just makes it look much more attractive. And particularly, his opponent, we haven't really talked about, but his
Mhm.
opponent in the primary and his opponent again in the general election is his main opponent in both is Andrew Cuomo, who was the governor of New York State for many years. For many years, the absolutely dominant politician in New York, really feared by everybody else, and expected, a few months ago to be a shoo-in for mayor. It was almost just, he was forced out of his role as governor after a number of scandals. He was sexually harassing women in his
Mm.
office. He was using public resources for his own private gain to have people work on his book he handled, it turned out, the COVID crisis, which initially he really got sort of he was really admired for his response to COVID, but it became clear that he'd really been covering up a lot of issues, and in particular, a lot of deaths in nursing homes that were the result of his, um, wanting to keep people in nursing homes that weren't safe. Anyway, so it was the sexual harassment stuff that forced him to resign, but it was on top of everything else. So he had resigned as governor, but it was almost like a consolation prize. Well, of course, he's going to become, mayor of New York. This is, the most powerful politician in the state a few years ago, and somebody who has all these relationships and is so the fact that he could lose decisively to a self-described socialist running on this radical platform, it just changes the calculations for everybody else. And I think we were already seeing this in New York a little bit, because something to realize about New York politics is that Zohran Mamdani is not a bolt from the blue. There have been a number. He was elected to the legislature as a socialist. He comes out of the Democratic Socialists. That's his political home, and he's never um, run away from that. But he's not the only one. We've got now half a dozen state legislators who come out of the Democratic Socialists and other officials. So um, that was already changing the calculation, I think, for a lot of politicians in the state,
Mm.
that if you want to be successful, you need to offer something more than the kind of standard, um, just kind of, we're going to run the government and just kind of keep doing things the old way. You have to have some positive message about how you're going to do more, have government do more to improve people's material lives.
Mm.
And I think all over the country. I mean, I occasionally talk to people in Washington, D.C., and I think, there's been this sort of just feeling of being stunned and helpless in the face of the Trump onslaught. Just because there's been such a departure from the way people understood American politics to work, and the rules and the norms. And, it's like the old formulas just don't work anymore. And people are really struggling to figure out what new model
Mm.
should look like. And I think Mamdani in this campaign is really gonna show people, here is an alternative, here is a way, because I think there's this feeling, on the one hand, we have to oppose this Trump administration and its attacks on democracy and on the public sector and on immigrants, but that if you want an electorally winning message, you have to focus on people's immediate material needs and day-to-day lives, and those things have been sort of opposed to each other. And I think Mamdani is showing that those do not have to be opposed to each other, that a radical message about the importance and value of the public sector and about our common interests as citizens and about collective democratic action and self-rule can also be a message about material needs and about the cost of living and about your day-to-day life, and those things are actually can be part of the same message if you can frame it in the right way. So I think people are definitely paying attention to that around the country. I think younger people, younger officials, younger staff members, perhaps especially even more than officials, who are always just looking for something to do. I think Mamdani is showing people this is something you can do.
Mm. And I guess there might be critics who say, well, maybe this works in New York, that it's super liberal, but this will never work in, say, Kansas or some red states.
Well, I don't know if it'll work in red states or not. I think there's a lot of challenges, beginning with whether you even have, free elections in some of these places. But I think there's a huge swath of the country that is notionally blue, where people have really failed to effectively use the power of government and popular support to advance any sort of progressive agenda. I think saying, "Oh, this is only going to work in half the country." Well, we've got an enormous amount of work to do in
Okay.
that half of the country, and I think over time, if you're successful and you have a positive model, people will adopt it elsewhere too.
Mm. And hopefully there will be an election in 2 years. Or I mean, i- is there any risk that you think Trump will sort of disband democracy and just stay on as a dictator, or
I mean,
is
I
that
think
over?
no, I don't think so.
Well,
Not in that sense. I mean, he's never going to say, "I don't think elections are canceled." I don't see that ever happening under Trump or any conceivable successor. But the problem is that maybe they don't need to because there's an enormous space to have the formal trappings of democracy and the substance be absent. I mean, look around the world.
mm,
In Turkey or Russia or India, there are elections. In India, they're even reasonably free and competitive elections, but in Turkey, they're at least somewhat free and competitive. In Russia, they're not very competitive. But in all those places, they have elections. They go through the motions. They do the stuff. And again, in Turkey and India, the ruling party does sometimes lose, but they don't lose power in at the center. They don't fundamentally lose. And it's easy to imagine a situation in the US, which we've had, again, historically, we had in the US South for decades, where you have a notional democratic process where, in fact, substantively, there's no opposition that can ever really take power. So I don't think the worry is that, there's going to be an announcement, elections are canceled. I don't think that's ever going to happen. But the problem is, I don't think it needs to happen. You can have a situation, and we're already, the Supreme Court is essentially given an open season to whatever the Trump administration wants to do. And if Trump is quite old and unwell, and I don't know that he's going to be alive in 3 years or physically capable of being out in public, but if he somehow was in a position to and wanted to run for another term, I suspect that our current Supreme Court would find some way of saying, despite
mm,
what the Constitution clearly says, he can run for a third term.
as long as you
Um,
don't doesn't mess with the Fed, they'll let him do anything.
well, we'll see about the Fed. The Fed it's a little bit of a question right now. So far, they have drawn a little bit of a line around the Fed, and which is actually interesting because we should be clear that the Supreme Court, as you say, has sort of made this weird and completely unprincipled exception for the Fed, in the sense that saying, all these independent agencies that were understood for, 100 years that the president cannot remove their leadership at will. And they said, actually, he can, but not the Fed. But it's also important to note that the Fed and Lisa Cook, who is the person he wanted to remove, people who haven't been following the story, they also stood up on their own. A lot of agencies, they don't wait for the courts. They say, well, if the president says somebody's gone, then they're gone. And Lisa Cook said, I'm not going anywhere. And Jay Powell said, well, I'm not firing her. And so, there's an element there which is partly about the courts, but also about the institution having enough autonomy and enough of a culture of standing up for itself. And that's, I think, but yeah, absolutely. In general, the courts are willing, Fed accepted, to let Trump do
Mm,
anything he wants to do. And I think that would extend to running for a third term if we got there. But the other danger, and we should be honest about this, is there's a danger that um, you have competitive elections and the Democrats win about half of them, but they adopt the biggest parts of the Trump program.
mm,
You know, there's certainly people on, and I mentioned our governor here in New York, Lisa, Kathy Hochul, got her start as opposing any extension of rights, in this case, driver's license to undocumented immigrants. And there's plenty of people in the Democratic Party who are vocally anti-immigrant. We know during the Biden administration, they tried to agree to a compromise with the Republicans that was substantially adopting the Republican program on immigration. And the Republicans wouldn't make the deal because they didn't want to make any deal with the Biden administration. But on the substance, they capitulated. The Democrats had capitulated. So you could imagine ICE continuing to operate in something like its current form under a Democratic president. The agencies that Trump has dismantled, the Internet Foreign Aid and, the science agencies, National Institutes for Health, a Democratic administration. Well, it's going to be a challenge in the best case to rebuild that capacity, but you could easily imagine a Democratic administration said, "Well, I think this just isn't something the government does anymore. The age of
Mm,
big government is over. This is not, something
mm,
that American people really want from government anymore." Um, and certainly given the influence of the tech sector, which I think is maybe something we haven't talked about, but really a fundamental at the root of, I think, a lot of what we've seen with Trump is this kind of revolt of the tech elite, this new center of power in the American business, American capital owning class is these extremely wealthy individuals in the tech sector whose interests are a little bit different than the traditional leadership of the capitalist class in finance. For instance, they're much more threatened by the power of their own professional and credentialed workers. This is a real problem for tech bosses. In a way, I don't think it's a problem for finance. And that I think feeds into some of the attack on professionalism coming out of the Trump administration. Um, they're more sensitive to regulation. I think finance in general is actually fine with regulation. I think it's actually kind of striking that in some sense, the exercise of the power of finance right now is to keep their independent regulator in place when everybody else loses their regulation. Finance doesn't, whereas the tech leaders, I think, are much more hostile towards regulation. I think there's a reason why we're getting this Trump government that, in my mind, is connected to the rise of this tech class and the shift of the tech leadership to the right, which is one of the really striking
mm.
features of this moment.
The far
But a
right,
lot
even.
of these people are traditionally supporters and donors to the Democratic Party, and you can imagine Democratic leadership saying, "We have to win back." This part of the business class, and we're going to assure them that we're going to continue the parts of the Trump program that are important to them. So I think, in my mind, it's not, we already have troops in the streets, right? But it's not going to be something where elections are suspended and members of Congress are hauled off and put on trial. And it's going to be the worst case is either, again, a sort of urbanization kind of situation, Erdogan situation where you have the formalities of elections, but the Republican Party never loses. Or the other worst case is you have the substance of elections with two parties competing for power, but the terms of the competition have been reset in the direction of
Mm,
Trumpism.
mm. And possibly a Mamdani win could perhaps revitalize democracy a little bit.
That's
It
right.
seems like that's one of his goals with what you mentioned. He wants to include tenants and citizens in making this decision, pointing out that these decisions are political and involving people in
That's
making them.
that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right.
So the election is November 4, and it seems like Mamdani will win, but we'll see. Before we close, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your new book coming out. I'm very excited about this. It seems fascinating, and I've been reading a little bit of what you've been writing on this topic before. It's about money, right? The
That's
book is
right.
called Against Money. Could
It's
you tell
called
us a,
Against Money.
yeah.
It's a little bit of a provocative title. It makes it sound like more of a polemic than it really is. But what we're trying to do in this book is go back to some of the sort of foundational debates about money, going back to Keynes in particular, but also Marx and other thinkers historically who really struggled with the question of what is money and what is the role that it plays in our economy, and trying to connect those with present day debates. What sort of say, well, what are the actual things at stake here? And one of the things, so sort of the overarching theme in a sense is that the problem that money is helping to solve is a problem of coordination. Economics traditionally says, well, the economic problem is about allocation. It's about scarce. This is the famous phrase, the
Mm,
allocation of scarce means among alternative ends. We've only got so much stuff. We want to find the best use for it. By letting people pay whatever they'll pay for access to stuff, we will get stuff to its best use. And the sort of Keynesian vision as we present it, that sort of alternative vision is one where the problem is not allocation, it's about cooperation. It's about people having to work together in very complex ways. And so it's not like we have a fixed amount of stuff. We know what it is, we know what it can be used for. We just have to pick the highest value of those uses. We don't know what we're capable of. We don't know what exists until we actually do the work of making it. It's a process of transformation, collective transformation. And money, in this sense, is a really powerful coordination device because it lets you cooperate with people you don't have any relationship with. It lets you cooperate with strangers. You don't need to have an ongoing relationship with somebody because they can just give you this token that somebody else you don't know who will accept. But by the same measure, it facilitates cooperation between strangers. It breaks up. This is sort of a famous observation that it breaks up all sorts of human relationships, reduces them to just the cash nexus. And so there's this tension between money as a vehicle for more extensive cooperation, a more extensive division of labor, but also as a sort of social solvent that breaks up existing relationships. So that's sort of the overarching vision that we think about money as a tool for cooperation. And therefore, of course, it's not neutral. The mainstream view is, well, you're exchanging this for that. You're exchanging stuff for stuff. Money is just the facilitator that doesn't really change the terms of the exchange. But actually, our argument is the terms on which money is available, the form that money takes, determines what kind of cooperation is possible. So it's never going to be neutral. And then we get into this in some more specific cases. We talk about, you know, uh, for instance, one example, the crisis in Europe, where you see, because this is the point where this sort of more abstract argument connects with some of the things we've just been talking about. You see how the fact that money is a vehicle for cooperation and the forms of money dictate what kinds of cooperation are possible means that money is going to be political and it's going to be a vehicle for power and for choices by particular actors, particularly around central banks. We spend a lot of time really trying to attack and criticize this notion of a natural interest rate, that the interest rate set by the central bank, the interest rate set by the financial system somehow reflects some kind of objective conditions of scarcity or some sort of objective market exchange between the present and the future. You just can't understand the interest rate that way. And so there's ultimately a level of, on the one hand, political choice exercised by central banks, and then convention and the sort of Keynesian story about liquidity within the financial system, neither of which are objective in any larger sense, and neither of which reflect any sort of conditions of material scarcity. So then when we turn, as I said, to the European crisis of the past decade, we can really see how what was presented as just sort of an objective judgment of markets on particular countries' sovereign debt really was a vehicle for a very particular political agenda pushed by the European Central Bank in favor of liberalization, a rolling back of the welfare state in parts of Europe, and that the sort of gyrations of the interest rate that put pressure on countries and the financial crises really did not reflect any sort of objective, failures of these countries or any sort of pre-existing imbalances in European trade, but reflected political choices about how this crisis was going to be handled and a sort of effort to force these governments in certain directions.
Yeah, we hear that all the time in Sweden as well about the bond market. So the bond markets are punishing these countries for being too profligate and for spending too much money. And if you spend too much, the market will punish you. But uh, as you said, it's the central bank. The central bank could just lower interest rates on these countries' debts. They can just buy how much debt they want, and that's what they eventually did to end the crisis. It was a political decision to allow
Right.
Greek debt to kind of grow out of proportion, to allow Greek interest rates to grow completely out of proportion. And then when Mario Draghi said, "Let's do whatever it takes to stop it," it just
Exactly.
stopped. And I think that was a really valuable lesson, but it seems that a lot of people in Europe have forgot about it or pretended it never happened. They're talking about France now in the same way. Oh, France has borrowed too much. They're in a crisis. They need to cut down their spending. But as long as the central bank, as long as the ECB stands behind French debt and is willing to buy French debt, there's no problem.
Yeah.
And if there's a problem, it's the political decision of the central bank. And I think that's something that it really needs to be pointed out again and again, I think.
Yeah, that whatever it takes moment was so vivid. I mean, it's like it showed the power of the central bank over the bond market is like the power of God of the Old Testament. You just speak the words and it is so.
Yeah.
That's all you have to do. But obviously, there was a choice first to let the crisis go as long as it did, and then to intervene. And second, of course, to exclude Greece from the
Yeah.
intervention, which was done in a very
Mm.
opportunistic way, not based on any principle. But as you say, despite that lesson, people still talk about the bond markets as this sort of objective force of nature. And
Mm.
I think, I mean, part of the motivation of our book is that this is not just propaganda. It's not just a minor confusion. This confusion is rooted in a very in a sort of failure to really grapple with what money is. And I think every textbook that people, study economics from, a lot of our daily language sort of assumes in some sense that money represents some objective physical quantity, that bond people who buy bonds, let's say, are providing some scarce resource that otherwise would not be available to the government. And the price of the bond, as reflecting the interest rate, reflects the relative scarcity of this valuable capital or savings or whatever it is the bond owner is providing. So I think you have to actually kind of do the work of freeing yourself from that vision of seeing money as actually this sort of arbitrary, not arbitrary, but distinct, separate system that is superimposed that interacts with the concrete world of material things and material needs, but it's not just a reflection of it. It's not just a representative of it. It is a separate system, and you have to actually do that intellectual work. Otherwise, you're going to keep getting sucked into this notion, well, bond prices are high because savings are scarce, and that's just a sort of fact
Mm.
about the world.
And I think this goes way beyond just sort of neoliberal ideology and people uh, sort of claiming that it's the markets that work because they are neoliberals or something like that. I think what you're getting at in the book is sort of more of a scientific issue. You're representing a different scientific paradigm from what is usually taught in mainstream, and that people uh, get this paradigm and they absorb this paradigm without having any politics involved. Really, it's just sort of that's the state of the discipline of economics, and that's the state of the science, sort of.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's a different you have to have a different systematic understanding of the world. You can't, this is a very familiar statement. You can't defeat a theory except with an alternative theory.
Mm.
And so you need to offer a different comprehensive vision. So we spend a lot of time in the book sort of criticizing the idea of real quantities in economics, that there's such a thing as real output, real income. Um, and again, I think in a certain sense that section of the book is not directly connected to immediate political questions, but I think it's a very important exercise to go through to again to understand that when you see money quantities or you see monetary values, that there is not an objective physical reality that those things are standing in for. And in a certain sense, you do have to kind of unpack, well, how are these real quantities actually calculated? How are they constructed, and what were the motivations of the people who created these things? And what are the other implications if we take
Mm.
this? You have to actually sort of do that work in order to free yourself from this kind of conventional way of thinking.
Mm. And I very much agree with your way of viewing the world as sort of money not being neutral. It's a force that can reshape the world, and also this idea of uncertainty that we don't know which resources we have, and how we should use them, how we should optimize. It's sort of we find out when we start creating stuff. We find out, and this I think is very relevant to climate change, or sort of the climate
Yes,
transition, that we
yes.
we actually need to start trying to switch technologies, and then we'll learn how far we can go, and how cheap we can make solar panels or wind turbines, and how fast we can get off fossil fuels. It's impossible to know that before we start.
Yes, that's absolutely right. We've had such a powerful lesson of that in the past few years. The idea, the sort of Nordhaus vision of climate
Yeah.
economics, where it's just this hard trade-off. If you want better climate later, you have to accept less consumption now, and there's a
Mm.
sort of cost you can assign to it. And then it's all about your discount rate to decide how much a livable planet 100 years from now is worth in terms of deferred consumption
Yeah.
today. But it's all complete nonsense. It has nothing to do with the actual problem facing us because we don't know what is possible for these technologies in advance. And we don't know until we actually have done, made the investments and started really, really committing to them. And when we do, it turns out the problem here is not scarcity. It's not that we had to give up other resources in order to invest in climate. In fact, most people's lives are going to be materially better off the faster you make the transition. There's no trade-off, and we've seen that so clearly with the incredible fall in price of solar and wind power over the past generation. I mean, it showed us so clearly that we live in a world of increasing returns, of living by doing, learning by doing, which means it's a world where thinking in terms of scarcity and trade-offs just does not capture the economic problem. It goes
Mm,
back to that issue I was raising before, which is the fundamental problem is coordination. The fundamental problem is collective decision making. That there's enormous opportunities. Objectively, we can be much better off materially without giving up anything, but we
mm.
have to all together make the necessary choices, and that is the hard part.
Yeah, I think that there is sort of perhaps a few areas where that sort of trade-off thinking actually makes sense when you think about should we cut down all the forests in one year and make a lot of money, and or should we leave the forest standing and sort of give up consumption, or sort of leave the oceans for a while. I think there are some areas where you actually have this real trade-off with the environment and the economy, but the sort of transformational work from switching from fossil fuels to renewables, that's where I don't think there's any real trade-off. And I was kind of heartened by the Nobel Prize this year. I think it's a big step forward from when Nordhaus, as you mentioned, he got the Nobel Prize in 2018. I was quite critical of that, mainly because of the sort of Schumpeterian vision that we've been touching on. We haven't mentioned it, but sort of this the role of creative destruction and sort of how that works and how that is driven by investment, and you don't have to give up any consumption in order to make these investments. But then I saw the summary of his work, the French economist Philippe Aghion, who's working in Schumpeter's sort of vein of economics. But it still seems that on this money issue, that he sort of has this very mainstream view that you critique. If I can just show you
Mm.
um, a picture here from that. Let's see if I can share my screen here. So he has this line here: money for investment in R&D originates in household
Yeah,
savings, and
yeah.
there's a big cog here that says household savings is driving this process. But I mean,
Yes. Well, you remember a couple years ago when the prize was for work of Bernanke and whoever the other person was on work on financial crises, and they had one of these little diagrams that
mm,
showed people literally bringing gold
yeah,
bars into the bank to
yeah.
deposit them. So whoever does the graphics for the Nobel Institute is definitely got a certain uh, pre-Keynesian mindset, let's say.
Yeah, and this is the mindset you're hoping to change with
Yes,
your book, right?
yes,
That
yes, exactly, exactly. I think it's very hard because this stuff is just really steeped into people. Everybody's, and as somebody who teaches economics professionally, it's something I really struggle with because you look for textbooks you can use, and every textbook is gonna have this stuff. The idea that there's a fixed amount of savings, which is scarce, which originates with the household sector, and then they make it available to firms, which is where investment comes from. This idea that everything should be, and again, as you say, it's not that there's no scarcity in the world. It's not that there's no trade-offs in the world, but this absolutely hegemonic vision that every economic problem can be understood that way.
mm,
It's very hard to get away from. And I think it's again, this is in some ways I would say the book is almost for Arjun Jayadav, my co-author and I, it's almost a record of our struggle to understand what is wrong with this vision and what the alternative is, and what the implications are of taking the alternative seriously. I think a lot of people who come out of the Keynesian tradition and not only are going to talk about endogenous money. There's that um, paper from the Bank of England that people like to point to that walks through very correctly, that banks create money. There's no role for household savings there. And yet, even though in that narrow context, maybe people understand it clearly, as soon as they're talking about something else, like in this example here, we're
mm,
back to household savings driving the whole process.
yeah,
So I think it's a real work to consistently apply a sort of endogenous money view of the world, a world in which banks create money, and therefore a world in which money is not a record of some scarce substance that we could call savings or capital or whatever, but it's simply a record-keeping device.
Mm. And I saw
Um,
that there was, sorry,
no,
there was
no, go
one,
ahead. Go ahead.
I read on your blog that there was one chapter that you sort of cut out from this book uh, about the political economy of the corporation as
Yes.
sort of a locus of conflict between the logic of money and concrete productive activity. And that sounds
Yes.
really fascinating. So I was glad to see that this chapter you're gonna work that into a separate book as well, right?
Yes, we are. That's what we're working on now, and I hope what we're hoping to do there is publish sort of pieces of it as we go. Uh, so, I hope we'll have something. I think we're going to try to do it on this um, online magazine called Phenomenal World. You may have seen.
Yeah, yeah.
I hope that we'll have sort of the first installment of this project up there relatively soon.
Mm. Because that was something that I found in my research when I was studying climate change and why some countries are better than others at developing clean tech, that it's actually has a lot to do with the corporation, corporate governance, and how the role of money and finance and production and how that sort of how the corporation is run vis-a-vis that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really a funny thing because, again, in terms of sort of the economics that's taught in textbooks and that informs our conventional wisdom, the corporation is just not there. It's a
Mm.
physical process. Capital is some sort of physical substance is combined with labor and produces output. There's a production technology, but there's no ongoing social organism that this happens through. It's just the stuff
Just
directly
a bunch of
connects with
contracts.
the labor. Yeah, it's just a
Mm.
bunch of contracts. And in a weird way, there's a certain strand of the Marxist tradition that is the same thing. You've got capital and you've got labor, and the capitalist is an active participant, but the organization of capital through these ongoing um, social organisms is not really present there, and it creates a whole set of problems that you wouldn't, you can that kind of get avoided, which is the problem of you've maybe generated a surplus in production, but whether that stays in the firm or in the corporation or whether it goes out of the corporation in the form of some kind of payout is actually a really fundamental question that just
Mm.
kind of disappears in a lot of accounts of production. And yet it's a really this conflict. I mean, as in our vision, this conflict between the corporation as an ongoing enterprise, as something that involves relationships of hierarchy, but also of trust, and then the goal of producing money, which is obviously anonymous, which is sort of the end of the relationship, is this constant tension. The business exists to produce a certain particular thing, carry out a particular production process, but the business also exists to make a profit. And these things are there's constant site of conflict between these two sort of visions of what a corporation is. I think if you start looking for this, you can see it, very consistently through history. Um, if you go back to the East India Company, the very first sort of modern corporation, in a sense, its beginnings come with a situation in which the original East India or the Dutch East India Company, I should say, was set up on a 20-year contract where these merchants are going to pool their funds to engage in trade with the Far East for 20 years, and then it's all the funds are going to get paid out again. And of course, during this 20-year period, the Dutch East India Company is building forts and hiring employees in the countries that it trades with and creating ongoing relationships. And then the managers of the company say, wait a minute, if you make us liquidate and return all the money to our shareholders,
Mm.
all this stuff is going to be worthless. You can't sell off the fort. It has no market value, but it has a lot of value as part of this ongoing system of trading. And so there's a big legal fight about whether they have to honor the terms of this contract. And eventually the Dutch government says, no, even though the contract says you're supposed to return all the funds to your shareholders after 20 years, we're not going to make you do that because strategically having this company operating is very valuable to us. So, and then this company continues existing. They never raise any money from shareholders again. They pay out big dividends. So the whole fight is not about, how do we raise funds for investment, which is the way the corporation tends to get framed. It's about what is this conflict between the outside financial claimants and the people who are engaged in running this organization on an ongoing basis. How much of the surplus it generates has to get paid out, and what kind of claim do the outside financial claimants have? Are they really the owners, or are they just entitled to a certain money payment? and how much is the value of the organization as an ongoing enterprise versus the market value of the stuff that it owns. So right at the very beginning of the corporation, we find this conflict. If you go, in the United States at the end of the 19th century, when our sort of economy really quite rapidly transitioned from private ownership, direct personal ownership of businesses to corporate ownership, all of the fights were about essentially founders of businesses wanting to exit those businesses. And the question, and then mergers, you've got a bunch of competing businesses, you want to combine them. So you have to pay off the existing owners. You have to combine the control of these businesses under one person, which means the other owners have to be paid off. So again, the whole question is about getting money out of the enterprise, figuring out a way of paying out your financial claimants to allow the enterprise to continue existing beyond the lifetime or beyond the outside of the control of the individual who started it. None of this is about raising funds for investment. It's about this conflict between having some kind of ongoing enterprise and the financial claims that people exercise against it, and obviously are sort of the ideological foundation of the authority of the people in the corporation, that notionally we live in this system of private enterprise and private ownership. And so notionally this business ought to be owned by somebody. But if you actually try to apply the rules of private ownership, business can't function. So I think, this is, again, this was originally going to be in the money book. It's been spun off, but I think it's a really deep and fundamental tension if we look at the history of the economies that we live in.
Mm. Yes, I definitely agree, and we'll have to check back with you when both of these books are out. And Against Money will be out in the spring, right? Spring of
Yes, yes.
2026. And the other book
And
was going to come out in 2027 or
we
something
hope
like
so.
that.
We
Yeah,
hope so.
yeah.
We'll see. Yes, but I would love, once the money book is out and you've had a chance to look at it, I would love to come back and talk about that.
Would love to have you. So thank you very much, J.W. Mason, Associate Professor of Economics at John Jay College at City University in New York. Thank you.
Thank you.